Hey guys, what's up? Welcome to a very special episode of Behind the Glass. I'm your host, Jared Frankel, and as you can see, I'm not in my room right now. I'm in a hotel room in Titusville because tomorrow I'm going to be going to Kennedy Space Center with other social media users to attend a NASASocial Moon2Mars event. It's going to be an awesome event where we're going to get to see lots of stuff that NASA is doing to prepare for SLS, to send humans back to the moon and eventually to Mars. We're also going to get to hear a speech from the current NASA administrator, Jim Bridenstine, and there's even the possibility that we may get to see the NASA Super Guppy plane. It's just a rumor, but I hope it's a true one, because that would be awesome. So, without any further ado, let's dive right into the special video. Alright, so you might be asking yourself, what is this NASASocial thing that I went to? Well, a NASASocial is an event that NASA does for social media users that is like a public outreach, where you can go and watch a rocket launch, get a behind-the-scenes tour, talk to scientists, engineers, and see what NASA is doing. Basically, you apply for it, and if NASA finds you worthy, they will select you, and you and a group of other social media users will get to go to a NASA center and do stuff around there, like watch a rocket launch or tour the facilities and get to see places that many other people don't. And then after it is done, you get to post what you see, what you hear on social media, like a public outreach for NASA through social media users. It's a very fun and interesting experience. You get to learn a lot about what NASA is doing and maybe even see a rocket launch. So if you want to know more about these, I'm going to put a link to it in the description to the NASASocial site and in the video, so that you can click on that and you will find descriptions of the socials, what ones they're having, the qualifications, and you can apply for one if you want to try your stuff at it. So if you ever want to do one of those, just go to the NASASocial link I've provided and see if you got the stuff. So without any further ado, let's dive right into what happened at the Moon2Mars NASASocial that I attended on March 11th. So first thing that happened is we got there, and there was a lot of other people from the NASA Icon Social that I went to previously, because the Moon2Mars was delayed and they gave us that one instead. And so a lot of people that were there were at this one as well. So I knew quite a few people that were there because I've seen them before. And so we were all hanging out and talking, and then they checked us in, gave us our badges, did the security sweep, and then they got us on the bus and drove us into Kennedy Space Center. And so we drove past the visitor complex, and the first place we stopped was the Vehicle Assembly Building. Alright, so we got to the Vehicle Assembly Building, and we got to go inside. And what we went inside of is called the transfer aisle. So the VAB is split into 5 sections. There's the whole building, and then on each side there's 2 high bays, and in the middle there's a transfer aisle that runs between them. And so the transfer aisle is where they would bring in the parts of the rockets, and then a crane would move them along the transfer aisle and put them in front of their respective high bays. And then that crane would take them over a barrier and move them into the high bay. Now, the high bays are the areas that go all the way to the top of the building, about 40 stories up. That's where the rockets are built. Those are about as tall as the Saturn V and will be about as tall as the Space Launch System rocket. And the VAB isn't capped off, so if they needed to, they could actually move those high bays up. Now, Greg Hale, who is pretty much our tour director, is really knowledgeable about the Vehicle Assembly Building. He talked to us a lot about what's going on in there. He explained about the Apollo work platforms that are still in there in the transfer aisle. They never really got rid of those because they didn't need to. There are the red platforms that are there on the sidings. And inside the Vehicle Assembly Building, there was a mock-up of the Orion capsule that's used for testing lifting with the crane. And there was this big tank of water in the back that was used for a weight test. So the crane would come along, and transfer aisle crane would come along and move that, and it would simulate the weight of spacecraft parts and fuel tanks. And so they were moving that around, and we got to see them moving the transfer aisle crane as seen in this video, which when we were there for the Icon Social, they were not moving that. The tank was not in there, and the mock-up was not in there either. The only thing that was in there was the abort test stage part. So that was going to be for the Orion abort test. They had the booster for that in the Apollo work platforms area. And so we got to walk around in there for a while, look around, take photos, and then they got us all back on the bus, and we headed over to Launch Pad 39B. So we are left the vehicle assembly building and are currently on our way to Launch Pad 39B. As you can see in the distance, there is Launch Pad 39A out there, standing very lonely with the crew access arm on it. Alright, so after we got to pad 39B, they drove us up the incline to the top of the pyramid-shaped launch pad, which is basically a giant mound of concrete with many structures and facilities inside of it and outside of it. So on the top, there's a bunch of equipment that is going to be used to interface with the Space Launch System and mobile launcher platform when it is on the pad. It is in the more clean configuration like it was for the Apollo program, back when the pad used to launch Saturn V rockets, Saturn I rockets, and then after that it launched space shuttles. So this pad has seen a lot of history. And in the middle of that is a 1.5 football field length flame trench, which is where the rocket thrust comes out so it doesn't rebound in the back of the rocket. And here's a picture of that from the back end of the launch pad. You can see in the middle a big divider, which is known as the thrust deflector, which kind of splits and channels the thrust outward right under the rocket. That has been updated. So has the flame trench, where they put several thousand heat-resistant bricks in there. They've also updated a lot of the systems on the pad, replaced a lot of the copper wire with fiber optics, updated the lightning towers, which those are 600 feet tall, and the VAB is only 525. So those are actually the tallest structures in Kennedy Space Center. There's the liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen tanks on either side of it, which hold 900,000 gallons of each liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. So those are pretty impressive. Greg Hale was up there giving us information about the pad. There was also somebody else from NASA that was talking about it. We got to take a few pictures. I took some pictures of myself with the flame trench and some of the other people that were there. Now these pedestals here are what the crawler sits the mobile launcher platform and rocket down on. There's like 6 of them, so it's only sitting on like 6 of these tiny pedestals. And then the bigger tubes are where the water comes from the water tower. And that is used for the sound suppression water and deluge system, which keeps the pad cool and also protects the rocket from acoustic vibrations. So, after we were done mingling around on top of the launch pad, we all got back into the bus and drove to the Neil Armstrong Operations and Checkout Building, which is where we had lunch and then went into the high bay to hear the speech from NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine. Once we got to the Neil Armstrong Operations and Checkout Building, they took us inside and had us go to the Sonny's barbecue that was inside, and that's where we had lunch. And as we were entering, the NASA Kennedy Space Center Director Robert Cabana was leaving, and he said hi to us. I didn't know it was him at the time, but if it was, I would have tried to say hi back and try to talk to him, but it looks like he was leaving, so I wouldn't have gotten that opportunity anyways. But that was nice. And so we sat down, had lunch, charged our phones, talked about what was coming, talked about stuff that we already did. So it was a little nice break from walking around and standing a lot. And a little bit more information about the Neil Armstrong Operations and Checkout Building. It's an Apollo-era building that back in the Apollo days, they processed the lunar landers and the command service modules in there. They did stuff for it with the Space Shuttle program, and right now it's being used to process and prepare stuff for Space Launch System. So inside of there, there's some Orion hardware. It's a pretty big building, and you'll see that in this picture. This is a picture of where they had to sit down in a high bay for the speech, and behind the podium is the Orion capsule, the pressure vessel at least, for Exploration Mission 2. So they're already working on that as of now. But there was a lot of media people there, a lot of people from NASA that were there for the event, and they crammed us into like 2 rows of seats. And so that meant I had to move around a lot to get good pictures and get good video. So some of the video of the speech is not the best. My camera decided to not focus some of the times, but it's all I've got. So now I'm going to talk about Jim Bridenstine's speech. Before Jim got up to speak, Bob Cabana got up there and said a few words. And he got down, shook hands with NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine, and then Jim got up to speak. Let me tell you, Jim is a very fun person to listen to speak. He's very motivational. His speeches are wonderful. Had a very great time sitting there for like hour and a half listening to his speech. It was not boring at all. Got me really pumped about the future of spaceflight. So, let's see what he had to say. So, at the beginning of his speech, he talked about the 2019 physical budget for NASA. Talked about what's funded, touched a little on the funding for Space Launch System and Orion and Commercial Crew and stuff like that. And then after he talked about the money stuff, he segued into the low boom sonic test flight, which right now is a project by NASA which is aiming to reduce the impact of sonic booms and, as Jim Bridenstine said, possibly make sonic flight possible again over the United States. That would be really huge. Like, think of the Concorde, but like everything. So everything's supersonic over the United States, not just over the oceans anymore. It would make air travel a lot different, that's for sure. And so we talked about that, and he talked about how NASA had imaged 2 T-38 fighter jets breaking the sound barrier. So this is an image of what NASA photographed of that. It went under a plane, and they were told to break the sound barrier at the exact moment they went under the plane. And this is the amazing image that was captured of 2 T-38s breaking the sound barrier. It looks really amazing. I'm sure NASA is going to have some great work with this, and hopefully they get to achieve that possibility of having allowing sonic test flights over the United States, or allowing sonic flights over the United States. That would be really great. Then he went on to talk about the X-57 Maxwell. Now, the X-57 Maxwell is an experimental plane operated by NASA that is fully electric. NASA is experimenting with these totally electric planes to try and see if it's viable for electric planes to be commercially operatable. So that means instead of using planes that are powered by your normal jet fuel, we'd have totally electric planes. And he says that's what enables us to reach places that we couldn't go before, make flights much cheaper, you'll have a less carbon footprint on the environment, and be overall beneficial if these came to fruition. Next, he talked about the more commercial side of spaceflight. He touched a little bit on Demonstration Mission 1 and congratulated SpaceX for their success on that mission. And then he went into talking about working with commercial partners, not only for the International Space Station in low Earth orbit, but also working with commercial partners to get to the moon. Yes, that's right. He said that NASA already has payloads ready to be launched to the moon, scientific payloads on commercial flights. And it should be noted that not long after his speech on March 11th, Jim Bridenstine tweeted that NASA was looking at options to commercially or privately launch the test flight for Exploration Mission 1. They were looking to commercially launch Orion. And they said that the SLS might be too slow to meet the time goal, that they would have to look at other options. So basically, he's told Boeing and the other manufacturers to get cracking, and we're going to have somebody else launch this. So I don't know how SLS is going to go, and progressively after the Moon2Mars, a lot more issues came up, so it kind of made the speech a little bit redundant in that aspect, but still, the speech was really great. Speaking of Space Launch System, after that he talked about the Gateway Station, and he talked about how through the solar electric propulsion, it is going to be a movable space station. It'll be able to go from the Lagrange points to like polar orbits and change its orbits using that solar electric propulsion unit. So we also got streamed a video from a NASA center where they're working on this technology for the solar electric propulsion unit. And they talked about how they're doing this and how crucial it is to the Gateway Station, and seems like a really interesting thing. It's going to be nice to actually have a space station that we can move around. Like, the International Space Station kind of has to stay where it is, whereas Gateway can actually be moved around in its lunar orbit, which I think is really interesting. Also, on the top of a Gateway, he also talked about human-rated landers. They said that NASA are looking for human-rated landers and trying to get those that will work with Gateway Station. So that means we can spend more time on the moon and keep going back to the moon. So these human-rated landers are going to go to Gateway Station, and then they'll go to the moon and then come back, refuel, and go back. Or they'll be a lot cheaper to launch because you won't need such a big rocket to get them over there, and they just go to the Gateway Station and then to the moon. So he talked about that a little bit. Then on the topic of physics, he went into heliophysics. And You might wonder, well, why is heliophysics important on our journey to the moon? Well, the sun emits a lot of deadly radiation and energy that gets blocked by Earth's magnetosphere. We don't feel all down here, but if we're on the moon or on Mars, we don't have that protective shield anymore, and we have to constantly be looking out for solar storms and radiation flare-ups that can hurt or damage spacecraft that are on their way to Mars or on the moon because they are not protected from these very vicious radiation sources that we here on Earth are protected from because of our magnetic field. So they said that they're going to, in the future, start to heavily more monitor the sun and find ways to hopefully even predict solar flares and keep it constant so that we can keep our astronauts safe while they're out there in deep space.
Friends, we need to make sure that when we consider our agency, I just talked about heliophysics and how important it is if we're going to send astronauts to Mars. How important is heliophysics to the lives of those astronauts? But just not those astronauts, but also the landers and the rovers and the robots. That means heliophysics is a critical piece of our Moon-to-Mars capability. And it goes beyond that. I was in the hotel this morning and I was talking to a lady who had the opportunity to visit the Kennedy Space Center. And she said one of the things that was most striking to her, and Bob Cabana, this is a compliment to you and your whole team, she ran into somebody at the Kennedy Space Center and asked him what he did. And he said, well, I'm helping us go to the moon and on to Mars. That was his answer. And she said, okay, well, what do you do? And he said, I'm a custodian. Friends, these objectives are an all of NASA approach. Every center that we operate, all 10 of them, are critical to this mission.
And then he goes on to talk about the impacts of the American space program on everyday life. He made an example that most or all of American banking transactions are done with a timing signal from GPS satellites. I never knew that. That's pretty interesting. There's a lot. He talked about some other stuff that NASA does that affects our daily lives that not many other people know about either. So he also made this really good point about how NASA needs to, and us, we need to help people understand what they do. And I'll play that video right now for you.
The way we do weather prediction and understand the climate, the way we do disaster relief and national security, the way we do banking. All of the banking transactions in the United States of America are dependent on a timing signal from GPS. A lot of people don't realize that. The way we regulate the flows of electricity on the power grid, dependent on a timing signal from GPS. Terrestrial wireless networks, dependent on a timing signal from GPS. When we think about how we have elevated the human condition, this little agency that constitutes less than one half of 1% of the federal budget, this little agency has elevated the human condition in ways that most people don't even know. It's on us to let them know. It's on us as the NASA employees, the NASA workforce. That includes our contractors as well. Let them know what we are doing to elevate the human condition, not just for the United States, but for the entire world.
And so after that, that was pretty much it. That was his entire speech. It spanned like an hour and a half. It was really fun to listen to. Had no complaints about it, although some of the stuff he said about Space Launch System almost backtracked like a few days after it when they came out with that thing about possibly looking at commercial options for Orion. But other than that, his speech was really good, and I hope to hopefully get to listen to or even talk to him again someday. It's a really motivational speaker, and I think he's doing a great job as the NASA administrator. So after we finished at the Neil Armstrong Operations and Checkout Facility, we went to the International Space Station Processing Facility. We arrived and they got us off the bus and we went inside. And instead of going up to like the observation area, we actually got to go inside the high bay this time, which we didn't get to do last time I went to a NASASocial. We only got to look into the high bay from the observation deck. So they took us in behind the intern cryogenic propulsion stage, which is the second stage of the first space launch system that will launch that's in there. They walked us through the high bay. We walked past old docking adapters for Space Shuttle Atlantis and Endeavour. We walked past a space station module that never went to space. And then we came to the very back of it, where Lockheed Martin had converted a space station module into a deep space habitat. They had set up a VR thing where you could put this VR headset on and look around inside of it to see what this thing was like. And they also let us tour it. So we got to go up on top of it and go into this module that was named Donatello. And we got to look inside of it and take photographs of it. And this is a mock-up of what a deep space habitat might look like on the Lunar Gateway Station. So they talked about how they made it, how they came across it, how they're going to give NASA and astronauts a tour of it to see if they like it, because they're trying to compete for contracts in this. And they also talked about the other module that was across from it, the Raphael module. There were 3. Raphael, Donatello, and Leonardo. Leonardo is on the space station. Raphael was on the space station and came back to Earth. And Donatello is the one that never went and was converted into a habitat by Lockheed Martin. And so I tried out the virtual reality thing, took some photographs inside and outside of the habitat. And then after we were all done with that, we left the International Space Station Processing Facility and drove over to Rotation and Surge Processing Facility, which is across from the VAB. This, during the shuttle days, is a building where they would bring the train with the solid rocket booster segments on it through. They would take them off of the train, uncase them, inspect them, and then send them over to the vehicle assembly building to be assembled for the shuttle. And it was shut down after the shuttle program ended, and then once SLS became active, they reopened it, because SLS is using the same kind of boosters that the shuttle does, except for one more segment. So they have to use this place to process them and send them to the VAB again. And inside of it is this big single segment inert casing, which is they're using for testing, moving, and processing. So that was in there last time we went. It's still there. And they talked about what they did to the work platforms, the history of the area, and they talked about our Rotation and Surge Processing Facility 2, which is across the way from it. And then they said we had a little bit more time before we went to see the NASA Super Guppy. So they drove us over to the crawler parking lot where the 2 NASA crawlers are parked. The NASA crawlers are the largest land vehicles in the world, and each of those treads on the crawler weighs at least a ton. And there's a bunch of them on there. So it is a very heavy machine with like a top speed of around 1 to 2 miles per hour. But there's a reason for that, because it's usually carrying a very expensive, very big and heavy rocket all the way out to the launch pad. And so we got to stay outside the fence and look at them and take pictures with them. And after we were done with that, we all got back on the bus and headed to the shuttle landing facility. Now, the shuttle landing facility is where the space shuttle landed during the shuttle days. It's a very, very long runway. And so when we got there, the NASA Super Guppy was waiting for us. And I was like, yes, because it's a sight to see. It's the most strange-looking plane next to the Beluga plane. It is big. And there's a reason for that, because they open up that hinged door on the front and fit in spacecraft parts. The Saturn V third stage would fit in there. They fit space shuttle simulators in there, parts of aircraft. They fit the Orion capsule in there. And the program director who was there told us that they're going to be taking Orion on that to Ohio for space systems testing, where they're going to test it in a space-like environment in one of their laboratories. So they're going to take the EM-1 Orion capsule from Kennedy Space Center to Ohio and possibly other places, and then back to Kennedy Space Center for Exploration Mission 1. And the NASA Super Guppy is actually a modified Boeing 337 Stratocruiser, which is like a 60s plane, so it's almost as old as NASA is, but it still works, and it looks really strange, but it gets the job done. And they say they have to have like a 7-person crew because it's a very analog. None of it's like almost none of it's electric. It's a very old plane, so a lot of stuff has to be done analog. And so every time it goes, it has like almost a 7-person crew. And so we got to take some photos with the Super Guppy, talk to some of the pilots and engineers that work and fly on the Super Guppy. And then after that, they told us it was time to go. And so we all headed back on the bus and went back to the check-in area, and that was it. Overall, it was a very fun experience. My second NASASocial. I love getting to hear the NASA administrator talk. We got to see some really cool behind-the-scenes stuff about NASA's return to the moon and possible journey to Mars later on. And I got to meet a lot of people that talk about space on social media, some of which I already know. So it was a great experience, and if you want to, like I said at the beginning of the video, there's a link in the description for you to apply for these and look at what they have available. So if you ever want to apply, just go in the description and click on the link to NASASocial, and I'll also put it in the corner of the video again right now. And so, hope you enjoyed this video, and if you like what you see, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe so I can get popular and make more videos, because there's no point making videos if nobody sees them. And if you have a comment or question, leave it in the comments and I'll get back to that as soon as possible. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.